What's up, guys? It's me here. So, if you're anything like me, you love America. You appreciate the freedom, the opportunities, and the values that this country stands for. But even though we're supposed to be living the best of times right now, it appears that the American dream is slowly but surely beginning to fade away and become nothing more than a distant memory. After all, we have nearly 60,000 people sleeping out on the streets. Nearly 90% of workers earn less than $34,000 a year. And our national debt just surpassed $30 trillion. dollars. But somehow throughout all of this, billionaires get to benefit from low taxes, endless bailouts, and of course, record-breaking stock market returns. So given how far apart our politics are today, what exactly is happening? How did we get here? And what does it mean for the future of our economy? Well, after getting a PhD in financial economics and working as an investment banker, I'll do my best to break it down for you. Although before we start, as usual, if you appreciate videos like this, all I ask for in return is that you take 2 seconds to hit the like button or subscribe. Doing this not only helps out tremendously, but it also makes sure that this stays free for everyone forever. So thank you so much. All right. So first we got to address the elephant in the room, which is that, yes, technically the United States is doing okay. Sure, inflation has increased at the fastest rate since 1982, but that's mostly due to supply chain bottlenecks, shortages of labor, and increased demand. On top of that, unemployment is near historic lows, with almost every single person who wants a job being able to find one. And GDP increased by 5.7% last year, indicating strong growth in production across the board. However, when you look beyond the surface, the data paints a completely different picture, because even though things might seem to be going well overall, the majority of people aren't seeing any of that upside. For example, while wages did increase by 4.7%, that was actually lower than the 5% rate of inflation, meaning that in terms of spending power, most people are actually earning slightly less money. In fact, research shows that from 2000 to 2018, the middle class lost 49% of their net worth. Even worse, the racial wealth gap is the largest it's ever been, with the average white family having 8 times more wealth than the average black family and 5 times more than the average Hispanic family. Now, to be fair, this isn't entirely anyone's fault. Throughout the last several decades, globalization and automation have caused a massive shift towards skilled technical jobs, while simultaneously driving up the cost of basic necessities like housing and education. That means fewer opportunities for advancement, longer work hours, and an overall decline in quality of life unless you're already financially comfortable enough to reap the benefits of what's happening. Because of that, despite record-breaking stock market returns, the reality is that 52% of Americans have no retirement savings at all, and 26% of Americans don't even have a bank account. Doesn't our government do something about this? Or doesn't the government have a responsibility to ensure that everything runs smoothly and that the markets don't run rampant with speculation and greed? Well, yes, in theory, but in practice, there is a very serious issue. In the big picture, our government is just as broken as the rest of us, because they're not capable of solving problems. And instead, they just pass the buck to the next person. As Albert Einstein once said, a government that is big enough to give everyone everything they want is big enough to take everything they've got. Now, whether you agree with that or not, it's hard to argue with the fact that our federal government spends over $100,000 per second and that they're currently on track to spend $1.9 trillion more than they bring in this year alone. Now, on one hand, I understand the need for the government to allocate funds to those who can't take care of themselves. However, when the government grows big enough where they can print unlimited amounts of money at the simple click of a button, it allows politicians to spend recklessly without any consequences. And that is what we're starting to see. For example, The government spent $1.3 trillion on COVID relief. But a recent study showed that 25 to 40% of that went to people who didn't even need it, meaning that the vast majority of Americans who did need it didn't receive any help at all. We saw something similar happen with the $500 billion stimulus package of 2020, where a report found that about 20 to 30% of that went to people who didn't really need it either. And it's not just wasteful spending that becomes a problem. They also tend to shift the blame to other entities. For example, according to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, Social Security will run out of funds in 2034. Medicare will run out in 2026, and the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund will run out in 2023. In all three of these cases, it's the federal government's responsibility to pay these debts and adjust the budget accordingly. But instead, they've passed it off to other agencies to deal with, hoping that someone else would deal with it. And that leads us to where we are today, where we're witnessing the effects of excessive spending firsthand. Even though the Fed has tried to reassure investors that inflation is transitory, the truth is that they've already raised interest rates and plan to stop buying mortgage-backed securities. All of that is a clear signal that inflation is getting out of control and they need to put a stop to it before things get any worse. And unfortunately, this is likely just the beginning. Like I mentioned earlier, people don't have enough money. The housing market is becoming unaffordable, and wages aren't keeping up with inflation. And now interest rates are going up. This means that people are going to have a harder time paying their bills, let alone saving for retirement or investing in the stock market. And that could have some ripple effects throughout the entire economy. In a normal market, this wouldn't be too big of a concern because businesses would step in and fill the void. After all, it's in their best interest to make as many sales as possible and expand to the growing population. But unfortunately, corporations are struggling just as much as the rest of us. Take Amazon, for example. They're losing billions of dollars a year, and they've been forced to raise prices to stay afloat. Or how about Disney? They've seen declining revenue, layoffs, and a massive drop in stock price throughout the last year. In fact, most of the S&P 500 companies are experiencing a major slowdown in revenue and declining profit margins, leading many economists to believe that we're soon going to experience a recession. Although, speaking of recessions, it seems like this happens every 7 to 10 years, right around the time that millennials start to enter their peak spending years. Coincidence? Maybe. But even if it is a coincidence, millennials are quickly becoming the new norm. By 2030, they'll make up 50% of the US population, and by 2042, they'll own 50% of the US wealth. That means it's more important than ever to invest early, often and consistently. On that point, although it's true that stocks are expensive today, historically speaking, since 1926, the S&P 500 has returned 10.4% adjusted for inflation. Not to mention, when you consider the fact that dividends have reinvested, the numbers look a lot better. And if history is any indication, the market will continue to go up over the long term. However, here's the thing. While the market is likely going to continue to trend upwards, the biggest gains come during recessions, and the best time to buy is usually right when everything is falling. The worst thing that you could do is sit out of the market waiting for a crash, only to realize that you missed out on the greatest opportunity to grow your wealth. That's why it's always a good idea to dollar cost average into index funds and hold for the long term. In fact, from 1980 to 2018, if you invested $500 a month into the S&P 500, you would have ended up with $1.4 million. But if you just took the same exact amount of money and kept it in cash, you would have ended up with nothing. Of course, none of this is to say that everything is bad, and that we shouldn't be optimistic. But it is important to be aware of what's happening, and to prepare accordingly. After all, the best way to make sure that the American dream doesn't fade away is to make sure that we're personally doing everything we can to make the most of our situation. So with that said, you guys, thank you so much for watching. Also, feel free to follow me on social media. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time.